I didn't need a detective or any fancy tracking apps to know what was happening. It was written all over her face, in every little gesture she thought she was hiding. The way she'd smile at her phone, the sudden changes in her schedule, the new clothes she started wearing, she thought I wouldn't notice. But I saw it all. This morning, though, she took things to a whole new level. It was early, barely past 8, and there she was, standing in front of the mirror, putting on makeup with a look of excitement she hadn't worn in years. That's when I heard it, a car horn blaring right outside our house. I didn't need to guess who it was. Nick. Her work friend. He was right outside, honking like he owned the place, like he knew she'd come running. Emma turned to me, her face set in that sickly sweet smile she'd perfected, and said, "Nick's already honking. Let's go, and I'll introduce you to him." Her voice was so casual, like she was talking about the weather, not about meeting the man she was throwing our life away for. I felt something snap inside me. Rage, betrayal, disbelief, it all bubbled up at once. I stepped closer to her, lowering my voice to a deadly whisper. "If he comes anywhere near this house, I'll break his jaw," I warned, each word dripping with anger. "And if you leave with him now, you'll regret it for the rest of your life." But Emma just looked at me with a smirk, pure defiance in her eyes, like my words meant nothing. "Oh, really?" she sneered. Without another word, she grabbed her purse, threw a last, dismissive glance my way, and walked out the door toward him. And I just stood there, watching, feeling every ounce of our 8 years together crumble to dust. She didn't even hesitate. She left, and I knew in that moment, this was just the beginning. After she left, I found myself standing there, frozen in shock. I watched as that sleek black SUV rolled down the street, taking my wife with it. The absurdity of it all hit me like a tidal wave. She didn't just cheat, she practically waved it in my face. I walked back inside, trying to shake off the anger and betrayal gnawing at my insides, but the silence of the empty house only made it worse. I looked around at the place we'd built together, every corner filled with memories, and all I could feel was disgust. For weeks, maybe months, I had sensed something was wrong. The changes had been subtle at first. Emma started coming home late from work meetings, then she'd barely talk to me when she got home, her face buried in her phone. I'd find her texting in the middle of the night, claiming it was just work stuff. At first, I believed her. Or maybe I wanted to believe her, to trust that the woman I'd built a life with would never betray me. But soon, the signs became impossible to ignore. There was the time I found an unfamiliar scent on her coat, something expensive, musky, nothing like the perfume she usually wore. When I asked her about it, she laughed it off, claiming a coworker had spilled his cologne on her by accident. I remember standing there, watching her brush it off like it was nothing, and feeling a twinge of doubt deep down, a quiet voice whispering, "She's lying." I shoved it down, convinced myself I was being paranoid. But now, looking back, I felt like a fool. She hadn't even tried to hide it well. I just hadn't wanted to see it. I wandered into the living room and sat on the couch, staring blankly at the walls, my mind racing. The pieces were all coming together now, every small sign and suspicious behavior adding up to one undeniable truth. She'd betrayed me. And she hadn't just betrayed me, she'd humiliated me. Publicly, too, parading around with him like she didn't have a care in the world. The anger started boiling up again, more intense this time. I wasn't going to let her play me for a fool any longer. I picked up her laptop from the coffee table, my hands shaking with a mix of adrenaline and rage. If she was going to act like this was no big deal, I was about to prove her wrong. I opened her emails, her social media accounts, anything I could get my hands on. And that's when I found it. There it was, plain as day, a string of messages between her and Nick, a thread of digital evidence that cut deeper than any words she could have thrown at me. They were laughing about our marriage, talking about how clueless I was, how he'd never suspect a thing. Every line felt like a punch to the gut, each message a reminder of how long she'd been leading this double life. I scrolled further, my heart sinking as I read the details, where they'd meet, the places they'd go, the dates they'd plan while I sat at home, waiting for her. One message in particular burned itself into my mind. It was a text from Nick to her, "You should leave him already. You know you'd be happier with me." And she replied with a laughing emoji, followed by, "Sooner or later, maybe I will. He's not exactly exciting, you know." That line cut deeper than I thought anything could. To her, I was just some boring, predictable fool she could brush aside whenever she felt like it. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the screen, my fists clenched so tight my knuckles went white. The pain was there, like a sharp, relentless ache, but the anger was stronger. She thought she could just toss me aside? Fine. If that's how she wanted to play it, then I'd play, too. I closed the laptop, my mind spinning with plans and possibilities. I was done waiting around, done letting her treat me like a doormat. She wanted excitement? I'd show her exactly what that looked like. I wasn't going to sit back and watch as she tore apart everything we'd built. She'd made her choice, and now I'd make mine. My phone buzzed, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was a text from Emma. "Be back later tonight. Don't wait up." The audacity of it made my blood boil all over again. She didn't even have the decency to lie convincingly anymore. She was out there, probably with him, and she couldn't even pretend to care about my feelings. I tossed my phone aside, disgusted by the whole situation. The hours dragged by as I sat alone, stewing in my thoughts, replaying every moment of our marriage, every time I'd trusted her, believed in her. I thought of all the times I'd put her first, sacrificed things I wanted just to make her happy. And for what? So she could throw me away like yesterday's trash the moment someone more exciting came along? By the time the clock struck midnight, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to be her fool anymore. I was done sitting here, waiting for her to come back and lie to my face. I was done being the pathetic husband she laughed about with her lover. This was the last time she'd treat me like this. When she walked through that door, she'd see a different side of me, a side she should have been afraid of before she decided to play these games. The sound of her car pulling up broke the silence, and I stood up, feeling a surge of grim satisfaction. The tables were about to turn, and Emma was about to learn exactly what happens when you push someone too far. The door creaked open, and there she was, slipping back into the house as if nothing had happened. She didn't even look my way, just tossed her purse onto the counter and headed toward the kitchen. The casualness of her movements, the complete disregard for me, was like gasoline on a fire. I stood in the shadows of the hallway, watching her, waiting for her to notice me. Finally, as she poured herself a glass of water, she looked up, her eyes widening a little when she saw me standing there. "Oh," she said, her voice lacking any real surprise. "You're still up?" Her tone was so nonchalant, like I was the one intruding on her life. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. "Did you have a nice time?" I asked, my voice cold. Emma blinked, and for a brief moment, I saw something flicker in her eyes, maybe guilt, maybe annoyance. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. She shrugged, sipping her water. "I went out with some friends." "What's the big deal?" I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Friends?" I stepped closer, my eyes never leaving hers. "Cut the lies, Emma. I know exactly where you've been." Her face hardened, and she set her glass down, crossing her arms defensively. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about Nick," I said, watching her reaction closely. She flinched, just slightly, but enough for me to catch it. "Don't play games with me. I know everything." For a second, she just stared at me, her mask slipping. Then, to my shock, she laughed, a short, mocking laugh that made my blood boil. You're being ridiculous, she scoffed, rolling her eyes. So what if I went out with Nick? We're friends. You're paranoid. Paranoid? I repeated, barely able to believe her nerve. I've seen the messages, Emma. I know exactly what you've been doing behind my back, how long you've been lying to me. You think I'm blind? You think I'm stupid? She looked at me, her expression turning cold and hard. If you're going to start throwing accusations, then maybe you should look at yourself. Maybe if you'd been a better husband, I wouldn't need to find company elsewhere. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I forced myself to keep calm. A better husband? I repeated, my voice a low growl. I've done nothing but love you, support you, and this is how you repay me? By sneaking around with some guy from work and then blaming me for it? Emma shrugged, her expression almost bored. People grow apart, Tom. That's life. Maybe you're just too boring, too predictable. Maybe I needed something more. The casual cruelty of her words was staggering. I felt my fists clench, the anger bubbling up like never before. So, that's it? I asked, my voice tight with barely restrained fury. You're just going to walk away from everything we've built, everything we promised each other, because you needed something more? You're willing to throw all of it away for some cheap thrill? Emma rolled her eyes again, that smirk back on her face. God, Tom, stop being so dramatic. Not everything has to be some big emotional meltdown. Sometimes people just move on. It happens. I stared at her, unable to believe what I was hearing. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I had loved and trusted, was gone. In her place was someone cold, selfish, and entirely unrecognizable. She wasn't even sorry. She didn't care about the hurt she'd caused, the trust she'd shattered. To her, I was just an obstacle in the way of her happiness, something to be discarded when I was no longer convenient. So that's it, then? I asked, my voice hollow. You're done with us? With me? She sighed, looking at me like I was some pathetic, desperate fool clinging to a lost cause. Look, Tom, maybe this is for the best. You'll get over it. Find someone else. Someone who's okay with boring. The arrogance, the complete lack of remorse, made something snap inside me. Fine, I said, my voice steady but icy. You want out? You can have it. But don't think for a second I'm going to make this easy for you. You've made your choice, and now you're going to deal with the consequences. Emma shrugged again, unaffected. Whatever, Tom. Do what you need to do. Just don't expect me to feel guilty for living my life. I watched her turn and walk away, her indifference like a slap in the face. She didn't care. She really, truly didn't care. The woman I'd married, the woman I'd given everything to, had turned into a stranger, someone who didn't care if she left me broken and humiliated. The rage simmered inside me, but beneath it was something even darker, a sense of finality. This was it. Our marriage, our life together, it was all over. And she didn't care. She'd left me no choice, and I was done fighting for someone who couldn't even pretend to care about me. As I stood there, alone in the quiet, empty house, I realized that I'd been holding on to a memory, a ghost of the person she used to be. The Emma I loved was long gone, replaced by this cold, unfeeling stranger who didn't care about the wreckage she'd left behind. I felt a strange, twisted sense of relief. The uncertainty, the guessing, the pain of hoping she'd change, it was all gone. Now, there was only one thing left to do, move forward, without her. But I wasn't just going to let her walk away cleanly. She thought she could betray me, humiliate me, and leave without consequence? She had another thing coming. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of calm. After the confrontation last night, I lay awake for hours, replaying every moment, every word she'd thrown at me with that cold, heartless expression. But in the quiet of the morning, something shifted. The sadness, the feeling of betrayal, they were still there, gnawing at me like open wounds, but underneath them, a new feeling began to grow: resolve. Emma thought she could walk all over me, treat me like a doormat, and then just move on without facing any consequences. She wanted more excitement, a way out of the boring life we'd built together. Fine. But I wasn't about to make it easy for her. She was about to learn exactly what it felt like to lose everything, to watch her world crumble, just as she had done to mine. I got up, dressed, and made my way to the office, my mind focused, determined. I'd been putting off dealing with the practicalities, avoiding the thought of ending things legally, but now that the shock was fading, I knew what had to be done. I wasn't just going to sit back and watch as she walked away, laughing at me with that smug smirk she thought she could hide behind. No. This was going to be a fight, and I'd make sure she regretted every choice she'd made. I contacted a lawyer. At first, the conversation was painfully clinical, discussing assets, property, finances. But soon, I realized this wasn't just about dividing things, it was about holding her accountable. The lawyer, an older man named Frank, listened carefully as I told him everything. He took notes, nodding, but there was a look in his eyes that told me he'd seen this before. Maybe he understood, maybe he'd been through something similar, but he offered a piece of advice that struck a chord. "Don't let anger cloud your judgment, Tom," he said, folding his hands on his desk. "I get that you're hurt. But focus on what you want to achieve. If you let emotions drive you, it can get messy fast." His words hit me harder than I expected. For a moment, I considered that maybe I was letting anger take control. But then I remembered the look in Emma's eyes, that dismissive, uncaring glare, and I knew this wasn't just about revenge. This was about justice, about making sure she faced the consequences of her choices. I was done playing the role of the nice guy. She'd made her bed, now she was going to lie in it. Frank helped me outline a plan. First, I'd file for divorce on grounds of adultery, making sure there'd be no way for her to contest it. Then we'd go after the assets, focusing on securing as much as possible for myself. We had joint savings, a house, a car, investments, all things we'd built together, things I wasn't about to let her walk away with, not after what she'd done. I could see from Frank's expression that he respected my resolve. He understood that I wasn't going to roll over. The meeting ended with a handshake, a silent agreement that we were in this together. But as I walked out of the office, I realized that legal action was only part of it. There was another side to this, something more personal. She'd done everything she could to make a fool out of me, to humiliate me, but she wasn't going to get away with it so easily. She needed to understand what she'd lost, to feel the sting of betrayal as sharply as I had. Over the next few days, I played my part well. I was calm, composed, almost indifferent. Emma noticed, of course, but she barely commented, probably relieved that I wasn't confronting her anymore. She probably thought I'd accepted it, that I was going to let her do whatever she wanted, give her the freedom to run off with Nick whenever she pleased. But she was wrong. I started gathering evidence. Every text, every email, every financial transaction that could prove she'd used our joint money to fund her escapades with him. I kept records, careful not to let her know. The plan was coming together, piece by piece, and with every new bit of information I gathered, my resolve grew stronger. This wasn't about getting even, it was about making sure she'd feel the full weight of her actions. One evening, as I was sifting through another stack of documents, the door opened, and she walked in, her face tired but smug, as if the world revolved around her. She didn't know what I was doing, and that only made it better. She saw me as a weak, predictable man, someone who would quietly accept her betrayal and let her live happily ever after with her lover. But little did she know, her fantasy was about to fall apart. "Working late again?" she asked, barely looking at me as she kicked off her shoes. Yeah, I replied coolly, not even glancing up. There's a lot to take care of. She snorted, clearly uninterested, and walked into the kitchen, her mind elsewhere. It was almost amusing, watching her act so nonchalant, so dismissive, while I was sitting on a mountain of evidence that would tear her life apart. She thought she was in control, that she had the upper hand. But she'd never been more wrong. That night, after she'd gone to bed, I stayed up, finalizing my plans, feeling a sense of grim satisfaction settling over me. She'd betrayed me, broken every promise, and tossed aside our life together like it was nothing. But now, she was going to see exactly what that meant. The next morning, I woke up early, ready for what was coming. Emma was still asleep, her face peaceful, as if she hadn't a care in the world. For a brief moment, I looked at her, wondering how we'd come to this. But then I remembered her words, her callousness, and any last traces of pity faded away. This was it. The final act. She'd wanted excitement. She was about to get more than she'd bargained for. As I left the house, I felt a strange sense of closure, a calmness that settled over me like a weight lifted. She thought she could destroy everything we had and walk away unscathed. But she was wrong. By the time this was over, she'd know exactly what it felt like to be betrayed, to lose everything. And I wouldn't look back. The wheels were in motion. I had set everything up with the lawyer, gathered all the evidence, and built my case brick by brick. Emma was clueless, living her double life, oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath her feet was already starting to crack. There was a certain grim satisfaction in knowing that she'd soon realize how wrong she was to think I'd just sit back and let her walk all over me. A few days later, I took the first official step. I filed for divorce, citing adultery, and sent the papers to her while she was at work. I wanted her to feel the shock in her office, in her safe place with Nick. I wanted her to experience the embarrassment, the panic, the realization that her actions had real consequences. It was no longer a game of secrets and lies, this was real, and she was about to face it head-on. I could imagine her reaction, the look of disbelief, followed by that mask of indifference she always wore when she was cornered. But this time, she couldn't just shrug it off. This time, there was no avoiding what she'd done. I wanted her to see, to feel the weight of her choices, and to know that she couldn't simply erase me from her life without a second thought. That evening, when I got home, the atmosphere in the house was thick with tension. Emma was already there, pacing the living room with the divorce papers in her hand, her face twisted in a mixture of shock and anger. She looked up as soon as I entered, her eyes narrowed into a glare that could cut through steel. "What the hell is this, Tom?" she spat, waving the papers at me. "You're seriously doing this?" I dropped my keys on the counter, keeping my expression calm. "What did you expect, Emma? You thought you could just walk all over me, throw away our marriage, and I'd be fine with it?" Her face flushed with anger, and for a moment, I could see the wheels turning in her mind, trying to come up with some kind of defense. "This is ridiculous," she said finally, her voice cold. "We could have talked about this. You didn't have to go behind my back and file for divorce like this." "Behind your back?" I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "The irony is unbelievable. You've been lying to me for months, sneaking around with Nick, and now you want to talk about what's fair. You made your choice, Emma. I'm just making sure you live with it." She stared at me, her face contorting with fury and something else, maybe fear, maybe regret, but I didn't care. The time for caring was long past. I'd given her every chance, every benefit of the doubt, and she'd thrown it all away. She wanted to play games? Well, now she was going to see what happens when those games get out of hand. "So, that's it?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're just going to divorce me and take everything we built together?" "Everything we built together?" I repeated, my voice rising. You mean everything I sacrificed for, everything I worked for while you were busy throwing it away for your more exciting life with Nick? Emma rolled her eyes, and for a moment, I felt that same rage boiling up, that fury that came from the realization of how little she actually cared. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't remorseful. She was just angry that her little fantasy was coming to an end, that she couldn't have her cake and eat it too. This is pathetic, Tom, she sneered. You're just doing this to get back at me. You think filing for divorce is going to make you feel better? Newsflash, it won't. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. I'm not doing this to feel better, Emma. I'm doing this because I refuse to let you continue disrespecting me, to keep pretending that we have something worth saving when you've already destroyed it. Her expression shifted, a flicker of something like panic crossing her face. And what about the house? The money? You can't just take everything from me. Oh, you mean the money you've been using to go on your little adventures with Nick? I shot back, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. Yeah, Emma, I'm making sure that every cent I earn doesn't end up funding your new life with him. You made this choice, and now you get to deal with the consequences. She opened her mouth to argue, but I held up a hand, stopping her. Enough, Emma. I'm done listening to your excuses, your lies. I'm done pretending that we can work this out. You wanted something else? You wanted freedom? Well, congratulations, you've got it. But you won't get to walk away from this unscathed. Emma fell silent, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly. For the first time, I saw a crack in her armor, a glimpse of vulnerability she was desperately trying to hide. It gave me a strange sense of satisfaction, knowing that she was finally beginning to understand what she'd thrown away. But there was no pity left in me, no desire to comfort her. This was her mess, and she'd have to clean it up herself. The rest of the evening passed in icy silence. She retreated to the bedroom, slamming the door behind her, while I stayed in the living room, my mind racing with everything that had happened. I should have felt a sense of victory, a sense of closure. But all I felt was emptiness, a hollow ache that wouldn't go away, no matter how much I tried to convince myself that this was what I wanted. Part of me wondered if I was being too harsh, if maybe there was a part of her that still cared, that regretted what she'd done. But then I remembered her laughter, her mocking tone, the way she dismissed me as boring and predictable. She hadn't cared then, and she didn't care now. I was just a roadblock in her way, an inconvenience she wanted to brush aside. As the night wore on, I thought about the future, about what life would look like without her. The pain was still there, raw and intense, but beneath it, I felt a sliver of hope. For the first time in months, I could see a life beyond the betrayal, beyond the lies. I could rebuild. I could start fresh, find someone who would actually respect me, someone who wouldn't take everything I'd given and throw it away like it meant nothing. And that thought kept me going, even as the house echoed with the silence of our broken marriage. I'd made my decision, and there was no turning back. Emma was no longer my concern. She'd chosen her path, and I was going to walk mine, alone, but stronger for it. The days that followed were strange, almost surreal. I'd spent years with Emma by my side, our routines intertwined so deeply that every corner of the house felt haunted by her presence. Now, she was gone. After the confrontation, she packed a few bags and left. No apologies, no goodbye, just the sound of the front door clicking shut, leaving an emptiness behind her that was both liberating and hollow. At first, the silence was oppressive. Each morning, I'd wake up and expect to see her lying next to me, as if everything was normal. But the bed was empty, the sheets cold, and it was a reminder that the life I'd known was over. I didn't realize how much of my identity had been wrapped up in being her husband, in being part of a partnership, until it was stripped away. It left me feeling exposed, vulnerable, like I was starting from scratch. I spent my first few days alone trying to keep busy, throwing myself into anything that could distract me. I went to the gym, worked long hours, even started cooking for myself, something I'd never bothered with when she was around. But no matter what I did, thoughts of her and the betrayal lingered in the background, a constant ache I couldn't shake. One evening, while sorting through some old photos, I came across an album from our early days together. Our honeymoon, family holidays, birthdays, all those moments that now felt like they belonged to someone else, like they were a part of a life I'd only dreamed about. There we were, smiling, laughing, our arms around each other as if nothing could break us. Looking at those photos now, knowing everything she'd done, filled me with a bitterness that ran deep. I thought about throwing the album away, tearing it apart even, but something stopped me. Those memories were real, even if she had ruined the ending. They were a part of who I was, of the man I'd become. I put the album back on the shelf, realizing that while Emma had betrayed me, I didn't need to erase everything. I could let go without denying the life we'd shared, painful as it was. Over time, the bitterness began to fade, replaced by something unexpected: gratitude. Not for Emma herself, but for the fact that I was finally free to find out who I was outside of our marriage. She had tried to make me feel small, to make me believe that I was just some boring part of her life. But in her absence, I started to discover parts of myself that I'd neglected, things I'd given up to keep the peace, to fit into the mold of the husband she wanted me to be. One night, I found myself out with a few friends from work, something I'd rarely done when I was with Emma. I'd always turned down invitations, choosing to stay home because she didn't like me going out without her. But this time, I accepted, and as I sat there in the dimly lit bar, laughing and talking, I felt a lightness I hadn't felt in years. It was like a door had opened, letting fresh air into a part of my life I'd forgotten existed. I realized then that Emma's betrayal, painful as it was, had set me free in a way I hadn't anticipated. She'd broken my trust, shattered my heart, but she'd also freed me from a relationship that had been holding me back for far too long. As the weeks went on, I began to rebuild, piece by piece. I threw out things that reminded me of her, redecorated the house to make it feel like mine again. Every small change felt like a step forward, a way of reclaiming my life and moving beyond the wreckage she'd left behind. Then, one day, I ran into someone from Emma's circle, a mutual acquaintance who didn't know about the divorce yet. She asked how Emma was doing, and without thinking, I replied, I wouldn't know. We're not together anymore. The woman's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. Oh, I'm so sorry, she said awkwardly, clearly caught off guard. I shrugged, a small smile playing at my lips. It's for the best, I replied, and to my surprise, I meant it. I didn't feel the sting of sadness or anger. I didn't feel humiliated or broken. I felt fine. It was a strange feeling, one that took me by surprise. I realized then that I'd truly started to move on, that Emma and the life we'd shared were slowly becoming a part of my past, a chapter one was ready to close. Over time, I started to make new connections, rekindle old friendships I'd neglected during my marriage. I found myself opening up to people, sharing parts of my story, not out of bitterness but as a way to let go. Each conversation, each moment of honesty, chipped away at the hurt, helping me rebuild my trust in others and in myself. One evening, as I was sorting through some of the documents from the divorce proceedings, I received a message from Emma. It was short, simple, just a question about some financial details she needed clarification on. But reading it, I felt none of the anger or resentment that had once consumed me. I replied calmly, politely, keeping it brief and impersonal. In that moment, I realized I was truly free. She no longer held any power over me. The anger, the pain, the heartbreak, all of it had faded, leaving only a sense of peace, of clarity. I'd let go of the life we'd shared, of the man I'd been with her, and in doing so, I'd found myself again. I wasn't the same person I'd been before her betrayal, and maybe that was a good thing. I was stronger, wiser, more self-assured. I knew what I deserved now, what I would never settle for again. Emma's betrayal had broken me, yes, but it had also forged me into someone new, someone I could be proud of. As I sat there, feeling the weight of everything I'd been through, I realized I had no regrets. Emma had made her choice, and I'd made mine. She was gone, but I was still here, still standing, ready to move forward into whatever life had in store for me next. And for the first time in a long time, I was excited about the future. Weeks had passed since I'd last heard from Emma. I had settled into a new rhythm, each day feeling lighter, like I was finally free from the weight of betrayal. My life was my own again, and each small step forward only solidified my sense of independence. I was ready to leave the past behind completely, or so I thought. One evening, I decided to treat myself to a night out. I went to a local restaurant, a place Emma and I had never frequented, somewhere that felt like neutral territory. I sat down at a table near the window, ordered a drink, and let myself sink into the quiet ambience. For once, I wasn't thinking about her, or the divorce, or the mess she'd left behind. It was just me, enjoying the solitude. And then, just as I was starting to relax, I noticed someone familiar across the room. I froze, disbelief flooding through me. It was Emma, sitting at a table, laughing, a drink in her hand. But she wasn't alone. Sitting across from her was Nick. The sight was like a slap in the face, dredging up emotions I thought I'd buried. There they were, as bold as day, looking like a couple without a care in the world. Anger flared up inside me, my fists clenching under the table. They didn't notice me, too wrapped up in their own little bubble, but that only made it worse. I could have left. I could have turned away and spared myself the pain of watching them, but something held me there. I wanted to see them, to face the reality of what she'd chosen, to let go of any remaining illusions. They were laughing, close, their heads leaning in as if sharing a secret. Nick was leaning forward, touching her hand, and she was smiling at him in a way that used to be reserved for me. It was surreal, watching the woman I had once loved so deeply now so comfortable, so completely at ease with another man. The anger simmered, but it was different this time. There was no longer a desire to confront, to lash out. I realized, in that moment, that their presence didn't hold the same power over me anymore. Yes, it hurt, but the wound was healing. Seeing them together wasn't the knife to the heart it once would have been. Instead, it felt like a final release, the last piece of closure I needed to move on. As I sat there, another feeling surfaced, pity. Not for myself, but for Emma. She had given up something real, something lasting, for a fling, a thrill she mistook for happiness. I realized that she'd chosen a shallow fantasy over the real, imperfect love we'd shared, and that was her loss, not mine. Whatever they had now, it would never be built on the foundation we'd had. And maybe that was the price of betrayal, a life without depth, without real trust. I stood up, ready to leave, but just as I turned, Emma's eyes met mine. She froze, her smile slipping, her expression a mixture of shock and discomfort. For a second, she looked like she might say something, might acknowledge me, but then Nick turned to see what had caught her attention. When he saw me, he gave me that same smug grin he always did, as if he'd won some kind of prize. In that moment, I felt a surge of calm confidence. They could play their little games, live their lives however they pleased, but I was no longer part of their drama. I was done being the casualty of their twisted story. I gave them a nod, a polite, detached acknowledgement, and turned to walk out. I didn't need to say anything. My silence said it all. As I left the restaurant, I felt lighter, a sense of freedom settling over me. That encounter, unexpected as it was, had given me exactly what I needed, proof that I'd outgrown her, that I'd moved beyond the pain she'd caused. They could have each other, I was moving forward into a future where they had no place. Back at home, I poured myself a drink and sat by the window, looking out over the city lights. It felt surreal, the thought of starting over at this point in my life. But as I looked back on everything I'd been through, I realized I had learned things I never would have known otherwise. Emma's betrayal had been a brutal awakening, but it had forced me to confront who I was, what I wanted, and what I was willing to accept in a relationship. I'd lost a marriage, but I'd gained something more valuable, a sense of self-worth that no one could take away from me. The next day, I woke up feeling like a new man. I went about my day with a sense of purpose, of joy even. The world felt open, full of possibilities I hadn't considered before. I decided to take up new hobbies, things I'd always wanted to try but had put off for the sake of keeping peace with Emma. I signed up for a cooking class, went hiking with friends, started reading books that had been gathering dust on my shelf. Each step was a reclaiming of my life, a way of proving to myself that I was capable of happiness, of fulfillment, without her. In time, I even found myself thinking about the possibility of meeting someone new. I didn't know if I was ready to date again, but the idea no longer filled me with dread. Instead, it felt like a door I might someday open, when the time was right. I didn't need anyone else to complete me, but I knew that if I did meet someone again, I'd be entering that relationship as a whole person, strong and self-assured. Looking back, I saw that Emma's betrayal, as devastating as it had been, was a turning point in my life. It forced me to grow, to become the man I should have been all along. I had once thought I needed her to be happy, to feel complete. But now, I understood that happiness came from within, from a sense of peace with myself. The past would always be a part of me, a chapter in my story, but it no longer defined me. I was ready for whatever came next, for a future where I called the shots, where I could be my true self without fear of judgment or betrayal. Emma and Nick were part of my story, yes, but they were also part of the past, a past I was finally ready to leave behind. And as I sat there, sipping my coffee, watching the world go by, I realized something profound. I was grateful. Grateful for the lesson, for the strength I'd found within myself, and for the future I was free to create on my own terms. Months passed, and each day took me further from the wreckage Emma had left behind. I had moved on in every way possible, mentally, emotionally, even physically. The house, once filled with memories of our life together, had been transformed into something entirely mine. I'd redecorated, repainted, replaced furniture, and even set up a small corner where I could unwind with a book and a glass of wine at the end of the day. It was my sanctuary now, a reflection of who I'd become. My new life was fulfilling in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'd joined a local hiking club, started exploring trails I'd never bothered with before, and even found a few new friends along the way. The freedom I felt was exhilarating, no more feeling like I had to answer to someone, no more biting my tongue to keep the peace. I was living life on my terms, and it felt good. Better than good. It felt like freedom. People started noticing the changes, too. Friends, colleagues, even family members commented on how different I seemed, lighter, more at ease. I realized they were right. The old wounds were healing, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from knowing I'd survived, that I'd come out of it stronger than ever. The anger, the bitterness, even the sense of betrayal, all of it had faded into the background, like noise I could barely remember. Emma and Nick were nothing more than shadows in my past, barely even worth a thought. One weekend, while I was out with a few friends, I met someone new. Her name was Sarah, and she was everything Emma hadn't been: genuine, thoughtful, and most importantly, honest. We clicked almost instantly, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark that wasn't overshadowed by doubt or mistrust. There was no game, no guessing. Just two people genuinely enjoying each other's company. We went on a few dates, casual and light, and I found myself looking forward to each one. She listened, laughed at my jokes, and shared her own stories with a sincerity that took me by surprise. I didn't rush anything, didn't push for more than what was natural. For once, I was content to just let things unfold, trusting that whatever was meant to be would happen in its own time. One evening, after a particularly good date, we sat on a bench by the water, talking about life, love, and everything in between. The conversation turned to past relationships, and I felt a twinge of discomfort, unsure how much to reveal. But Sarah was patient, understanding, and as I told her about Emma, she listened without judgment, just quietly absorbing my story. When I finished, Sarah looked at me with a soft smile, a warmth in her eyes that put me at ease. "It sounds like you went through a lot," she said. "But it also sounds like you came out stronger. Sometimes, the hardest things teach us the most." Her words resonated, and in that moment, I knew she was right. Emma's betrayal had been painful, yes, but it had also been the catalyst for growth, for change. It had forced me to confront my fears, to find strength within myself that I never knew I had. I'd learned what I deserved, what I would never tolerate again. I'd come to value honesty, respect, and trust more than anything else, and I knew that if I ever loved again, it would be with someone who cherished those same values. In the days that followed, my relationship with Sarah continued to blossom. We took things slowly, allowing ourselves the time to truly get to know each other. And with each passing day, I felt more at peace, more certain that I was exactly where I was meant to be. Looking back, I realized how far I'd come. Emma's betrayal, once the most painful experience of my life, now felt like a distant memory. It was a chapter I'd closed, a part of my story that had shaped me but no longer defined me. I'd learned to let go, to forgive, not for her, but for myself. Forgiveness, I discovered, wasn't about condoning her actions, it was about freeing myself from the grip of the past, allowing myself to move forward without resentment or anger holding me back. One evening, while going through some old boxes, I came across a few remnants of my life with Emma, photos, letters, small mementos of the love we once shared. I looked at them, not with bitterness or sadness, but with acceptance. She'd been a part of my life, a part of my journey, but that chapter was over. I'd found closure, and more importantly, I'd found myself. As I packed away the last few items, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a feeling of contentment that came from knowing I was finally free. Free from the pain, free from the anger, free to live my life on my own terms. I had walked through fire, faced the depths of betrayal, and come out the other side stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever life had in store. The future was no longer something to fear, but something to embrace. And as I looked out over the city lights that night, I felt a profound gratitude, for the lessons I'd learned, for the strength I'd found, and for the new life I was building, one step at a time. In the end, Emma had given me the greatest gift of all, the chance to start over, to rebuild from the ground up, to create a life that was entirely my own. And as I moved forward, I knew that I was ready for whatever came next, with a heart open to new possibilities, a spirit unburdened by the past, and a future full of hope.